dinner ended in 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when she started talking, and I checked it again when the first police car pulled into the driveway. 11 minutes. That's how long it took for 23 years of scheming to come apart. But I should go back to the beginning. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 64 years old. I built a commercial real estate business from one small office in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I have one son. His name is Preston. He has his mother's eyes and, God help him, my stubbornness. My wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer 8 years ago. It was the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself all at once. It comes in pieces, for years afterward. The empty chair at Thanksgiving. The coffee cup she left on the windowsill that I couldn't bring myself to move for 6 months. Preston and I got through it the way men in our family always have, quietly, side by side, without saying nearly enough. So when Preston called me on a Wednesday evening in October and said, "Dad, I want you to meet someone," I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, something that resembled hope. Her name was Renata. She was 31 years old. Preston was 34, and she had moved to Charlotte 2 years earlier from Miami. She described herself as a lifestyle content creator, which I later understood to mean she posted photographs of herself at expensive restaurants and resort pools and called it work. She had a following, a substantial one. Preston showed me her page once, proudly, and I scrolled through it with the careful attention of a man who has reviewed 1,000 contracts. Something felt off. But I couldn't name it yet, so I said nothing. We met for the first time at a steakhouse downtown. Preston had reserved a corner booth. He was nervous in the way he used to get before baseball tryouts as a kid, straightening things that didn't need straightening, laughing a little too quickly. I wanted to put my hand on his shoulder and tell him to breathe. Instead, I ordered a bourbon and waited. Renata arrived 7 minutes late, not enough to be rude, just enough to make an entrance. She was striking, I'll give her that. The kind of woman who understood exactly the effect she had in a room and had made peace with using it. She hugged Preston like she'd missed him desperately, even though they'd apparently seen each other that morning. Then she turned to me with a smile that reached her eyes on a slight delay. "I've heard so much about you," she said. I said I hoped it was mostly good. She laughed, a practiced laugh, pleasant and warm, and slid into the booth. The dinner was fine. She was charming. She asked me questions about my work, which I appreciated, though the questions themselves were strange in retrospect. Not, "What kind of buildings do you develop?" or "How long have you been in Charlotte?" She asked things like, "Is the business structured as an LLC or a corporation?" And, "Do you have partners, or is it entirely family-owned?" I answered vaguely, the way I've learned to do in business settings when I'm not sure of someone's angle. But I told myself I was being paranoid. This was my son's girlfriend. She was probably just trying to make conversation. By dessert, she had pivoted to talking about children. How many did I think was ideal for a family? Did I believe in private school? She and Preston had already discussed it, she mentioned casually, as though they'd been together for years rather than 4 months. I drove home with a tight feeling in my chest that I couldn't shake. I mentioned it to my older sister, Nadine, a few days later. Nadine has always been the sharp one in our family. She spent 30 years as a family court attorney before retiring, and she has a particular gift for seeing through people. I told her about the questions at dinner, the Instagram page, the way Renata had spoken about children with a man she'd known less than half a year. Nadine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bernard, when a woman asks a man she just met how his business is structured, she's not making small talk." I sat with that. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention. I had lunch with Preston twice a month. We'd done it since Carol passed, a standing thing at a diner near my office. He talked about Renata constantly. How brilliant she was, how driven, how she understood him in a way no one else had. I listened. I asked careful questions, and slowly, a picture began to form. Renata had moved Preston from his apartment in Southend to a rented house in Dilworth, a nicer neighborhood, closer to her aesthetic, she'd said. His group of friends from college, the ones he'd had since his 20s, had mostly stopped calling. He'd missed his friend Doug's wedding in October because Renata had booked a trip to Scottsdale that same weekend. Preston didn't seem to think anything of it. He said Doug understood I found a private investigator named Gerald Thorne through a friend who'd used him in a business dispute. I want to be clear about how I felt making that call. I'm not the kind of father who meddles. I raised Preston to be his own man, and I've always respected that. But I was 63 years old, and I had watched my son lose his mother and rebuild himself, slowly and painfully, into someone whole again. And something in my gut, the same instinct that had kept me out of 3 bad business deals over the years, was telling me that this woman was not what she appeared to be. Gerald delivered his report on a Tuesday morning. I read it in my car in the parking garage because I didn't want to be at my desk when I went through it. Renata had been evicted from an apartment in Brickell, Miami, in 2021, 18 months before she moved to Charlotte. She had a civil judgment against her from a former boyfriend, a lawsuit over approximately $40,000 she had borrowed and never repaid, claiming it was a gift. The lawsuit was settled out of court. There was a second man in Fort Lauderdale who had apparently paid off her car lease and several months of credit card debt before she ended the relationship and moved on. The Instagram following was real, but the income from it was not. She had made roughly $11,000 from brand deals in the past year. The resort photographs, the designer items, the lifestyle, most of it borrowed, financed, or provided by men who believed they were in a relationship with her. I sat in that parking garage for a long time. I didn't tell Preston. Not yet. I knew how it would land. He would hear it as jealousy, as control, as a father who couldn't accept that his son had found someone. He was in love, or something that felt like love to him. And love at that stage is not a conversation you can interrupt with a spreadsheet. So I waited. I kept my concerns quiet and I watched. The engagement happened in January. Preston called me from a rooftop restaurant in Uptown, barely able to get the words out, and I congratulated him because that is what you do when your son tells you he is happy even when you are afraid. Renata posted a photograph of the ring within the hour. It had 43,000 likes by morning. The engagement party was scheduled for March. Preston and Renata had rented out the terrace of a hotel in Ballantine. 90 guests, catered, an open bar. Renata had handled most of the planning. I noticed she had also been kinder to see it on the billing correspondence, which Preston mentioned in passing, as though it were unremarkable. 3 weeks before the party, Renata called me. Not a text, a call. On a Thursday afternoon, while I was reviewing site plans at my desk, my assistant put her through, and when I picked up, Renata's voice was warm and bright, the way it always was. "I was hoping we could get dinner," she said. "Just the 2 of us. I'd love to get to know you better before the party." I said that sounded fine. We met at a restaurant in South Park she had chosen. She arrived on time, which was different, ordered a glass of wine, chatted pleasantly about the wedding venue they'd been looking at, asked about a golf trip I'd taken the previous fall, and then, about 40 minutes in, she set her glass down and looked at me directly. "I think we should talk honestly," she said. I waited. "Preston mentioned that you two had some tension before the holidays," she said. "He didn't give me details, but I can tell he's been a little uncertain about where things stand with you. And I want you to know, I want this to work. With you, with the family." She paused. "I also want to be honest with you. I'm not wealthy, Bernard. Preston knows that. I've worked hard, but I've also had some difficult years. I want to build something real with your son. But I need to feel secure, and I think some of what would help is knowing that Preston and I have a foundation, a real one. Financial security matters to me. I want to be transparent about that." I asked her what she meant specifically. She took a sip of her wine. "I've been thinking about a prenuptial agreement," she said. "But actually, I'd like to suggest the opposite. Rather than protecting assets separately, I think it would mean a great deal to me if you made a gesture of good faith before the wedding. Not a loan. A gift. Something that showed me I'm being welcomed, that I'm not an outsider." I asked how much she had in mind. She said $300,000. I kept my face very still. It's something I learned in 20 years of negotiation. Let the other person sit in the silence, because silence will tell you more than any question. She added quickly, "I know it's significant, but I also know what your business is worth, Bernard. Preston talks about it, and I want to feel like I'm starting this marriage as a real member of this family, not someone who's always on the outside looking in. I told her I would think about it. I drove home and I called Gerald Thorne. The next 2 weeks were careful ones. I met with my attorney, a man named Lewis, who has handled my business affairs for 15 years, and we had a frank conversation about what I was dealing with and what my options were. I also called Nadine. She listened to the whole story without interrupting, which for Nadine is rare. She's escalating, Nadine said. The request for money before the party, that's not a first move. That's a woman who has done this before and knows how much time she has left before the situation closes. I thought about that framing. How much time she had left, as though she were working to a deadline I didn't know about. I went to the engagement party. It was a beautiful evening. The Ballantine Terrace had a view of the city that turned gold as the sun went down, and 90 people came and ate and drank and laughed, and Preston looked genuinely happy in a way that broke my heart a little, because I knew what I was carrying. Renata moved through the room with the ease of someone completely at home, kissing cheeks, laughing at the right moments, touching Preston's arm possessively whenever another woman spoke to him. She was very good. I'll say that again, because it matters. She was very, very good. I'll say that again, because it matters. She was very. About an hour into the party, she found me near the bar. Have you thought about what we discussed? She asked. She kept her voice low, friendly, the way you'd ask about a recipe. I told her I had. She said, and? I said I wasn't comfortable with the arrangement she'd described. The warmth in her face changed, not disappeared, shifted, like a gear catching. She steered me gently toward the far edge of the terrace, away from the nearest cluster of guests, and when we were far enough away, she said quietly, Bernard, I want you to reconsider. I asked why. Because, she said, I have a very clear memory of what happened in your office. 6 weeks ago, when you asked me to come by to look at those documents, I remember what happened very clearly, and I think a jury would find my account compelling. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about Carol. I thought about Preston at 12 years old, pitching a no-hitter in the rain. I thought about everything I had built over 40 years that could be dismantled by the very specific kind of accusation she was describing. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and I placed my phone on the railing between us, screen facing up. The recording application had been running for 38 minutes. Renata looked at the phone. Then she looked at me. The color in her face changed in a way I had never seen a person's face change before. You've been recording this conversation, she said. I told her I had been recording all of our conversations since the dinner at South Park. What happened in the next 4 minutes I will not describe in detail because some of it is still part of a legal proceeding. What I will say is that she did not handle the moment gracefully. The voices near the bar went quiet. Preston crossed the terrace. My son looked at me, then at her, and then at the phone on the railing, and he asked, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, what was going on. I told him the truth. All of it. Right there on that terrace, with the city going gold behind us and 90 people pretending not to watch. I told him about Gerald's report. I told him about the dinner at South Park and the $300,000. I told him about the Fort Lauderdale man and the civil judgment in Miami. I told him about the recordings. Renata left the terrace before I finished. She didn't get far. Lewis had already been in contact with the appropriate parties. A civil attorney was present at the hotel, not in uniform, not conspicuous, and the recordings were in the process of being reviewed that evening. The specific charges that followed are a matter of public record, and I won't enumerate them here. But extortion carries consequences in North Carolina that Renata had apparently not fully researched before choosing Charlotte as her next city of operation. Preston didn't speak to me for 16 days. I won't pretend that didn't hurt. It was 16 days of silence that felt longer than any silence I'd sat in since Carol died. He was not angry in the loud, confrontational way. He was quiet, withdrawn. The way he gets when something has reached a part of him he doesn't know how to protect. I gave him the space because I've learned that my son processes things in his own time, and because some part of me understood that what I had done, however necessary, had also dismantled something he believed in. That grief deserves room. On the 17th day, he came to my house. He stood in the kitchen where his mother used to make biscuits every Sunday morning, and he said, "How long did you know?" I told him. From the beginning, I'd had doubts. From Gerald's report, I'd had certainty. He asked why I hadn't told him sooner. I said because he was in love, and because I could have been wrong, and because the only thing worse than finding out the truth would have been having his father take it from him before he was ready. He stood there for a long time, looking out the kitchen window. Then he said, "I bought the ring with Mom's savings account, the one she left me." I hadn't known that. I went over and I put my arm around my son's shoulders, and neither of us said anything for a while. The kitchen smelled like it always does. Coffee and old wood and something faint and particular that I've never been able to name, but that has always meant home. "I should have listened," Preston said. "I told him that wasn't how love works. He asked me if I thought he'd ever stop feeling like an idiot. I said yes. I told him it would take longer than he wanted, but shorter than he feared. I told him that his mother had always said the people who get hurt the worst by that kind of thing are the ones who loved the most honestly, and that if that was true, he should be proud of himself, not ashamed." He laughed a little at that. A real laugh, rough around the edges. The case moved through the legal process over the following months. Renata had retained a defense attorney, and there were weeks of motions and filings and the particular grinding anxiety of waiting. Lewis kept me informed. Gerald stayed available. I went to work. I had lunch with Preston on Tuesdays, and I let the process do what processes do. The recordings held. That's the part that matters for the story. The recordings were clean. The civil extortion statute in North Carolina was clear, and the prior history from Miami and Fort Lauderdale provided what the prosecutor described as a pattern of conduct that was difficult to argue against. Renata entered into a plea agreement in September. I was not in the courtroom for the hearing. I had decided that closure, for me, did not require witnessing her sentencing. I found out the terms from Lewis over the phone while I was sitting on my back porch watching a storm move in from the west. I thanked him. I hung up. I watched the storm come. Preston moved back into his apartment in South End. He started calling his college friends again. Doug, whose wedding he had missed, met him for a beer the first week of October, and apparently they stayed at the bar until 2 in the morning catching up. Preston told me about it at our Tuesday lunch with a kind of sheepish relief on his face, the look of a man reclaiming something he hadn't realized he'd surrendered. I still keep the recording backed up in 3 places. Not because I need it anymore, because I am 64 years old, and I have learned that the things you document carefully are rarely the things that ruin you. A few months after everything settled, Preston asked me how I'd stayed so calm on that terrace. How I'd stood there and listened to her make that threat without flinching. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told him that I'd been afraid. That I want to be clear about that. I was afraid, because the kind of accusation she was describing can reach a man through walls he didn't know he'd built, and there is no completely rational response to that fear. But I had also spent 2 months preparing. I had done everything correctly, carefully with Lewis and Gerald and Nadine and all the quiet patience I could manage. And when you've done everything right, there is a particular kind of stillness that comes. Not confidence, not certainty, just stillness. The knowledge that whatever happens next, you showed up. Preston nodded. Then he said, "I want to be like that. Someday." I told him he already was. He just didn't know it yet. He still calls me every Sunday evening the way he has since his mother died. We talk about work, about the weather, about whatever game was on that afternoon. Simple things. The kind of conversations that would look like nothing from the outside and are, from the inside, everything. Last Sunday he mentioned he had met someone, a woman named Ellen, a physical therapist who volunteered on weekends at a dog rescue shelter in Mooresville. He'd met her at Doug's birthday dinner. She had laughed, he said, at all the right things and none of the wrong ones. I told him that sounded promising. He said, "Don't run a background check." I told him I would think about it. He laughed. A real one. That's the sound I was protecting all along. That laugh. It sounds exactly like his mother's. I keep thinking about that kitchen moment. Preston standing at the window, the morning light coming in flat and grey, telling me he'd used his mother's savings to buy the ring. That detail has stayed with me longer than any of the rest of it. Longer than the recording. Longer than the courtroom proceedings. Longer than the 11 minutes on that terrace. Because that's where the real cost was. Not in my business, not in my reputation, in a young man who loved honestly and got taken apart for it. I've lived long enough to know that what happened to Preston, and what happened to all those men before him, in Miami, in Fort Lauderdale, doesn't happen because people are stupid. It happens because they're decent. Because they want to believe the best about someone they care about. Renata understood that. She was skilled at finding it, that particular combination of loneliness and goodwill, and she knew exactly how to make it work for her. That's not bad luck. That's a method. And a method, eventually, leaves a pattern. The pattern is what Gerald found. The pattern is what saved us. What I did right. And I want to be clear that I made mistakes along the way, including waiting too long to confront things directly. What I did right was refuse to let fear make the decision. When she made that threat on the terrace, I was afraid. I want to say that plainly, because I think men of my generation are not supposed to admit that. But the accusation she was describing could have undone 40 years of work in a news cycle. That's a real fear. What I'd done in the weeks before was prepare so carefully and so honestly that the fear had nowhere to run the situation. I had done the right things, so I could stand still. I think about the difference between reacting and preparing. Most of us react. Something happens and we scramble. What this situation required, what any situation like this requires, was the willingness to slow down when everything in you wants to move fast, to think clearly when your emotions are telling you to act, and to do the unglamorous work of documentation and legal counsel and uncomfortable conversations with investigators, while the person you love is still convinced everything is fine. That is not exciting work. It doesn't feel like strength while you're doing it. It feels like waiting, but that kind of patient, clear-eyed thinking is the only thing that actually protects the people you love. And the character part, the part that cost me the most, was staying honest with Preston even when the honest thing was painful. I could have softened it. I could have found a way to let him discover pieces of it gradually, let him arrive at the conclusion himself, and feel less like his father had dismantled his world for him. I chose to tell him everything, plainly, in that moment on the terrace, because I believed he deserved the full truth, even if the full truth was going to hurt us both. He came back. That's what I want people to hear. The silence lasted 16 days, and then my son came back to that kitchen, and we stood together the way we always have, quietly, side by side, and that was enough. The truth costs something. It always does, but it leaves you with something real to stand on afterward, and that's more than most compromises can promise. Preston is having Sunday dinners with Doug again. He laughed on the phone last week. His mother's laugh. Whatever it cost to get here, I would pay it again without hesitation.